I hope this feels like an intimate conversation by the time we're all done. Thank you for leading the way. I really appreciate it. We have lots of ties to Grand Rapids, so whenever anybody asks me to do anything in Grand Rapids, I don't care what it is, I just come to Grand Rapids. So I have my daughter Haley with us tonight, my youngest, and just really appreciate being with all of you as friends. Thanks for coming tonight, and thanks for your interest in this work. I thought I might begin by talking a little bit about the personal side of how this book came into being. Then I think I want to talk just a little bit about some biblical and theological learnings that I've had while writing this book, and then we'll get to the practical. So sort of three moves. And one of the things that I was thinking about as I came tonight was I've been doing podcasts for probably 2 months, 3 months, like 4 and 5 a day on some days. It's blowing my mind. It's very different than the last time I published a book because, now everybody has their own podcast, and so we're not saying yes to all of them. We're trying to be discerning. We're not saying yes to the person who's podcasting to 5 people out of their basement, but still, it's a lot, and I am still pondering kind of what these things mean. This is so intense. But one of the things coming into this event that I thought I could do to structure our time together was to talk about several of the questions that I have most appreciated, the questions that I just love to receive, and the questions that have brought something out of me that felt really honest and true. So I thought I might share a couple of those questions tonight and actually respond to them here with you. So the first question that I want to mention tonight is the question, where did this book come from in you? That's a question I've gotten several times. Where did this book come from in you? Because the truth is, I've written about Sabbath before. I've written a chapter on Sabbath and sacred rhythms, and I wrote a chapter on Sabbath for leaders in Strengthening the Soul of Your Leadership. So where did this book come from now? Well, for the first part of the question, it came from the publisher. I got the opportunity to have a sabbatical, and after that sabbatical, I wanted to write about sabbatical because I couldn't find many resources for my own sabbatical guidance. And I thought, wow, I needed guidance. We all need guidance. Maybe I could serve a little bit like a spiritual director and help people with their sabbatical. But of course, publishers are always thinking the way they should. They're thinking about numbers and, whether or not, the audience will be big enough. So they felt like that was a little bit too niche. And they said, would you be willing to write about Sabbath and sabbatical? And I thought, oh my goodness, I don't know if I have anything new to say about Sabbath, but I will try. And so I did. And I'm really grateful because the truth is I had some more things to say about Sabbath. I had written about Sabbath in a very personal way before about our personal practice of Sabbath. But writing this book gave me a chance to lean more into the communal dynamics of Sabbath keeping, to really identify it not as a private discipline, but as a communal discipline, as God has given it to us. And I was able to start writing about the idea of Sabbath communities, which I'll talk about in a little bit. And so there really was something more I wanted to do with this topic. And I'm really grateful to a visionary editor and publishing group who said, we think, that it'd be great if this book could be about Sabbath and sabbatical. The other thing that's clearer to me now than ever is that sabbatical is just an extension of one's Sabbath practice. And in fact, having had a Sabbath practice actually helps you as you enter into a sabbatical because you know what the inner dynamics are, you know what they're meant to be. You've had some practice with stepping out of your public life and actually becoming more hidden and allowing God to be with you in a very private and personal way. And so sabbatical is not quite as intimidating if you have been practicing Sabbath. And I discovered that to be the truth for me. So that's one way to answer the question, where did this book come from inside you? It came from the publisher having a vision. But the other thing that is very true for me is that at this point in my life, and I've been in active Christian ministry now for I don't even know how many 4 years, something like that. And I have much more of an awareness now that the Sabbath is the practice that is saving my life. Barbara Brown Taylor asked this wonderful question, and it would be a great icebreaker. What is saving your life right now? And if someone were to ask me that question, I would say categorically, unequivocally, the Sabbath is saving my life. And so I thought, I haven't written from that place yet. I haven't written from my understanding that the Sabbath is saving my life. And I think that other people's lives could be saved if they saw Sabbath not just as a lifestyle suggestion, but actually as a gift from God that God is longing for us to receive, as well as being one of the 10 Commandments. It is the fourth commandment after all, and I'm not quite sure how we all get away with not practicing the Sabbath. I think many of us have our ways and our reasons. I know that for myself, early in my life, people were saying, well, that was Jewish practice. That does not apply to us today. We don't have to practice that today. Or Jesus didn't teach about the Sabbath, so we don't have to practice Sabbath today. But I don't agree with either one of those ideas. The truth is that the Sabbath began with God in Genesis 1. The Sabbath was something that God did. It's a part of the way God exists in God's self. So it begins with God. And then when God called the people to himself, he said, I want to give them a really good gift. I'm going to give them the gift of the Sabbath. And that's what he did. And so for me, one of the exciting things about this whole Sabbath idea, and I've identified it more strongly in this book than any other book, is that the Sabbath is one way that we actually participate in God's nature. In 1 Peter 2, it talks about the fact that we are participants in the divine nature. And I believe that when we practice Sabbath, we are actually participating in the divine nature. We are entering into something that is essential to God, essential to God's way of being, and therefore essential to us. So it's a very personal thing as well to realize now. It's been sort of in my life that I have been practicing Sabbath for 20 years. Practice has deepened in my life over time, and that my life is probably more full now than it's ever been. And I'm so grateful for the Sabbath because it saves my life week by week by week. Now, the Sabbath came to me, I think, God's leading and invitation when I was in my early 40s, and I tell the story in Sacred Rhythms, and I tell it again here in a much more abbreviated way. But by the time I reached my early 40s, I had been achieving and performing and working really, really hard for God for a long time. And at first, I kind of enjoyed my life that way. I had experienced Sabbath as kind of a legalistic practice in my pastor's home, my pastor dad's home. I'm a pastor's kid. And we did practice Sabbath, but there was nothing about it that was delightful or winsome. My dad was a pastor, and so it meant that, we were in church and we tried to behave during church because everybody was watching us as children. And then we would come home, and as a pastor's family, we often did hospitality. And the women folks worked harder than anyone else on the Sabbath, serving and cooking and cleaning up. And there's something very wrong with that picture, but we're not going there tonight. We'll do that another night. So the Sabbath was anything but restful or delightful. It was very legalistic, and then we weren't allowed to do the things that I thought would have been fun to do on that day. So I kicked it to the curb. The minute that I left my pastor family, I kicked that one to the curb. And so in my early 40s, I was actually teaching other people about many spiritual practices, but I was actively resisting the Sabbath at that point. And then I had this little biking accident where I was riding my bike one day. I was crossing the sidewalk in front of a parking lot, and an elderly man, who I think was just very confused, his reflexes weren't what they could have been. He actually, rather than saying stop, he actually pulled out in front of me, and I knew I was going to go down because I saw it, but I couldn't stop fast enough to avoid it. So I went down on my bike, and he kind of ran up over my legs, which were still entwined with the bike. And it was one of those moments of utter clarity where I remember thinking, I hope he gets his van off me soon because this really hurt. That's what went through my mind. And by God's grace, there was a paramedic, an off-duty paramedic truck that went by, and they picked me up, scooped me up off the sidewalk, and took me to the emergency room. Because of cell phones, I could call my husband right away, and he could meet me there. But in the days that followed, what was really interesting is that I just didn't stop. I just got right back up and went right back to work the next day. And I remember one of my friends who knows me really well, she said, Ruth, you could take a day off. You did just get run over by a car. I thought, oh, wow, that one hurts. And then someone else said, Ruth, when are you going to learn that when you're on a bike, you cannot take on a van? Which was also a part of my personality. And so after a bit, when the bruises started to come and I had a fracture that I didn't know about and it was still hurting, I did take a little bit of time. And God began to really speak to me about the Sabbath because I had been reading about the Sabbath. I had been reading beautiful books on the Sabbath, and sometimes it was also beautiful that I would cry and weep about it. But I thought that isn't a too hard pile for me. I was, again, in my early 40s with teenagers in my home, and I was on staff at a church, and so I couldn't figure out how in the world to find Sabbath. But God began to really work with me in that moment. And I think there was just enough space for God to start saying to me, you know what? We need to talk about this. The way you're living is not sustainable. And I remember one of Wayne Mueller's statements where he said, if we do not take our Sabbath, then our cancers and our illnesses and our accidents will become our Sabbath. I was like, oh, wow. I mean, that was the moment of being knocked off my horse right there, like being knocked off his horse. And so God and I started dealing, and I started really attending to the desire that I had for a way of life that worked. I started attending to the level of exhaustion within me. And I started to sense that even though I couldn't see how Sabbath would work for me in my contemporary life situation, that I needed to start trying to walk towards my desire. I needed to start saying, God will meet me, God will help me. This is God's gift to me. I want this. I'm going to start learning how to order my life with it. So this journey is so very personal for me. And even though I don't always do it perfectly, I am absolutely committed to a Sabbath practice. So that is my personal story about Sabbath. And of course, it emerges from getting to a place in my life where Sabbath wasn't enough. And that's sort of the bridge in the book between part 1, which is about Sabbath, and part 2, which is about sabbatical. Is that there came a moment when I realized that I was facing Mondays and I wasn't rested enough. I would get to Monday and I would dread my work. I would get to Monday and I would be overwhelmed. I would get to Monday and I would not know how to face the week. And I realized that even though I was such an avid Sabbath practicer, it was not quite enough for me. And it was hard to admit that, as someone who had been practicing Sabbath so religiously, if you will, saying it's not enough, I'm still tired. And so at that point, I was able to begin to think about sabbatical for myself, and then also present it to our board as something that I felt that I needed. And they met me immediately with great love and great attention, and they just made it happen. Not only did they give me the time, but they also raised funds to cover the expenses of it. And there's just so much love. I felt so much love from them in that moment, so much care and concern. And then our staff rallied and they wanted it for me as well. And so they stepped up to carry the responsibilities of the Transforming Center, which is my little organization. And so it felt like a very loving gift, not only from God, but also the people around me who love me so much. And so the sabbatical portion of the book is very passionate about the need that especially senior leaders have, the bus stop care people, the people who are preaching every single Sunday, the people who are on call days and nights for emergencies and things like that. That part of a Sabbath community, part of a Sabbath life, is that not only do we rest every seventh day, but then on our seventh year, there is the gift of a longer sabbatical. And that also comes from God. It's embedded in the Old Testament, part of God's gift to the Jewish people and to us, I believe, but it's also embedded in the agricultural rhythm. Anyone who knows about agriculture knows that the ground, the land is not meant to produce over and over and over again, season after season after season, but that the land needs to lie fallow too every seventh year. And so it's rooted in the rhythms of our universe and in the reality of our physical world. And so the sabbatical journey was a beautiful gift. I've had 2 sabbaticals since then, and just have sought to offer some guidance, not only for the individual pastor or leader who needs a sabbatical, but also to give the group, the elders or the board or whoever it is that would bestow that gift, to give them a rationale and some ideas for how to prepare and how to get ready to give this within your community. So that's the personal part of the story. Where did this book come from in you? That's where it came from. But this practice of both Sabbath and sabbatical is what is saving my life these days. And I'm aware also that when you fully enter into Sabbath as a gift from God, you do begin to fall in love with God all over again. People have asked me, what did you learn about God on your sabbatical? What have you learned about God in your practice of Sabbath? And I'm not sure it's all about what I've learned, but I will say that every Sabbath I fall in love with God again, because God has chosen to give us this great gift. And I just think, how could you not love a God who would give you something this good? And how can you not say yes to a gift that is this beautiful and this life-changing? So that's the first question. Where did it come from in me at this time? But then another question that I just love is the one I mentioned. What did you learn about God? What have you learned about God in these things? And the truth is that I did dig in even more into the biblical and theological foundations for Sabbath and sabbatical. And I learned a couple of things that I'm really, really excited to share in this book. The first one is the fact that Sabbath comes from God, and I think I knew that, but I still felt that the cultural reality of the Jewish tradition was still bigger in my mind. But in this work, I came into the full realization that Sabbath is from God. That Sabbath begins with God. It emerges from God's own person. It emerges from the way in which God chose to do God's life in creating our world. That's one thing. Another thing that I learned from digging more deeply into the biblical and historical narrative about the Sabbath is that God gave this gift to the Israelites not as sort of a soft, restful, everybody's taking a nap sort of idea, but that when God first gave the Sabbath, it was a sign of resistance. It was a form of resistance that people who were oppressed got to enter into. Because up to that point, the Israelites had no right to rest. The pharaohs, the harsh taskmasters, were working them so hard that they had no opportunity to rest. And so the idea of having a Sabbath is actually the sign and the symbol and the lived reality of freedom from oppression, liberation from oppression. That is so exciting. So when God gives the Sabbath as one of the 10 commandments, God identifies himself as the God who led you, who liberated you, who led you out of bondage. And then he goes on to say, and I'm giving you the Sabbath. So it's related to God's work of liberating us as human beings. And so the more I got into this topic, the more I realized that we are being invited into liberation today, that we are in bondage today to life in our culture, this 24/7 thing we've got going now with our cell phones and everything else. Our work is always accessible to us. People are working in the middle of the night. They're working on the weekends. They're working on Sundays. We are in bondage, my friends. We are in bondage to a culture that doesn't know anything about rest. And so for us, Sabbath is resistance. It is resisting what the culture is saying to us every day about what is required. It's also liberation from our own inner bondage. And you know what I'm talking about. The bondage that we feel to our own ego-drivenness, to our own performance-oriented drivenness, to our own ambitions, to our own achievements, everything in us that just is driven towards productivity and achievement. We need to be free from that part of ourselves as well. And the Sabbath is our way out. The Sabbath is our way into freedom and liberation. So I no longer think about the Sabbath as being primarily about naps, even though it is. And everybody should take a nap on the Sabbath. I don't want to diminish that at all. But it's not this really soft practice. It's actually a practice that involves resistance and gives us a way to resist life in our culture and also to resist our own inner drivenness. So I learned that about God. That God is a liberating God, not just for the Jewish people way back then, but for me. That God wants to liberate me from the ways that I am in bondage through this amazing practice of the Sabbath. The other thing I learned, and I learned so much, and I'm just so excited about this, I began to realize in a more clear way that the Sabbath is not primarily a privatized discipline. Did you know that? It's not just about you finding a way for you to get a quiet day on Sunday. That is not what it's about. The Sabbath was given by God to a people, to a community. And the reason it worked for them was because they did it together. The whole community did it together. And so one of the passions and one of the visions I have for this book is that it is directed towards leaders. Unabashedly, it's directed towards leaders and pastors. I'm trying to cast a vision for how they might lead their own communities into a Sabbath practice. And they would begin with their own practice, just as I've begun, able to stand somewhere and say, the Sabbath is saving my life. It's one of God's greatest gifts. But you have this inner authority that comes from your own practice. And then because you know how good it is, if you're a leader at all, you want to share what's good with the people that you lead. And so then maybe you would share with your elders, maybe you would share with your staff team. You would tell them your own story of your own vulnerable experience. You would tell them how much you care about them and how much you want this goodness for them. And maybe as you all start to practice, then eventually you say, you know what, there's a call on our lives. There's a call on our lives to share this with the people that we have been given to shepherd. Because one of the things that's so interesting to me in the historic narrative is that the Sabbath instruction was not given to the spiritual formation pastor. It was not given to some underling. The instructions about Sabbath and the mantle of leadership having to do with Sabbath was given to the highest level anointed leader in the community, and it was Moses. And even when Moses needed to go back to the people when they were confused, about how to do it, and they messed up the first time around. God didn't go to Aaron or to Caleb or to anybody like that. God went straight back to Moses and said, here's what you need to tell the people. And it needs to be you. It needs to be you. It needs to come from the highest level anointed leader in the community, because it's so countercultural and it's so hard to trust it. And they need to hear this from you. They need to hear it from your heart. So I see this as a leadership issue now. I'm identifying it as a leadership issue. I'm identifying the fact that it's really hard for individuals to practice Sabbath when the communities they're a part of do not practice. So one of my own personal pieces of history is remembering a time in our church life, where I wasn't on staff at a church anywhere. And so I thought, oh, good, now our family can practice the Sabbath. So we chose a church to go to, and we went. And lo and behold, what we discovered was that the church loaded everything that they did into Sundays. So the youth groups all met on Sundays, the small groups met on Sundays, the choir practice happened on Sundays, the painful congregational meetings happened on Sundays. I'm like, I don't know how you have a Sabbath when you get called back to church to have a meeting where they get Sabbath, you know? And so what I found was that it wasn't the culture that was preventing us from having a Sabbath, it was actually this church, the light of the church. It was Christian busyness that was preventing us from having a Sabbath. And that was so devastating to discover. That the church itself and the church's practices and the way that they schedule wasn't enabling our family to have a Sabbath. And I became convinced in an even deeper way that individuals cannot practice Sabbath well and effectively if the church is just layering up all the Christian busyness. So my hope for this book is that it's not just going to be an individual read for people to try to figure out their own Sabbath practice, although the first 8 chapters will help you with that. But in chapter 9, actually in chapter 4 and in chapter 9, I turn a really big corner and I really start to talk to leaders and to talk about their responsibility to order their lives and their communities around the practice of Sabbath, so that perhaps eventually they might even be able to identify themselves as a Sabbath community. And so that's a phrase that I've coined for the first time in this book, is the idea of becoming a Sabbath community, where you really are ordering your life around the gifts of Sabbath, and every decision that you make, you look at it through the lens of Sabbath, and how will this enable us to continue to keep a Sabbath as a community. I have lots more to say for that, but I'm not going to do that right now. So that's the question of what did you learn about God? I learned lots, and I love God more for having gone deep and having read this book, or written this book. And then finally, a question that I really appreciate, of course, is how. Like every conversation I have gets to the how. How in the world do we do this? Because it's so countercultural. And I have really sought to make this book very, very practical. I encourage people to organize their thinking about Sabbath around 3 ideas: rest, worship, and delight. That whatever we do on the Sabbath really should fit into one of those categories. And the one that may be most, unexpected to some of us is this idea that we could actually think about what we delight and organize a whole day around what we delight in. Wow. If you call the Sabbath a delight, that's Isaiah 58. If you call the Sabbath a delight, the idea of delight is deeply embedded in the Sabbath practice. And to delight in the simple gifts of our lives, our families, our own couch, our own fireplace, our own backyard, if we have those things. Good food that we often don't get a chance to savor. The process of making a nourishing soup, which is one of my favorite things to do. I don't have time for that during the week, but I sure love to do it on the Sabbath. Crawling back into bed and taking a nap, or napping in the sun under a tree, or in a hammock, or on the couch. It's also true that lovemaking is something that's expected on the Sabbath as well. In fact, in the Jewish tradition, you get brownie points if you do it twice. So, hey, you gotta love a religion like that, right? You heard it here. But, going for a walk in the leaves, but certainly moving slower throughout the day and having your conversation slower. And maybe you even save some things that you need time for to talk about with your loved ones on the Sabbath or right after the Sabbath, when you slow down and when you're not so stressed and when you can bring your best self. Or maybe you're an artist in some way, and that's the time that you can do some woodworking and get into that creative flow, or write music, or do painting, or for me it would be writing poetry. Things that that come up and out when we touch that creative core of who we are on the Sabbath. It's amazing to me that God would need to give us a whole day every week to just figure out what delights us and to actually engage in it. So to think about those categories, to think about what you need to not do on the Sabbath in order to have time and space to do the things you want to do on the Sabbath. So we exclude work. We exclude those things that cause stress and worry because we work really hard at the level of our mind. I have a big chapter in this book on technology because I personally really believe that there needs to be some level of unplugging from technology or managing technology differently on the Sabbath because so much mental stress is created by what's coming in to us through our cell phone. And so, I mean, I quoted an author in here, her name is Tiffany Shlain, she's a secular Jew, but she talks about the power of unplugging, and she talks about preparing for the Sabbath by copying off directions. If you're going someplace that you need to go to, reinstalling a landline, making sure that anybody you're going to get together with, you've already made the plans, you don't have to be checking your phone, all sorts of really, really practical ideas about how to actually unplug. And that's going to take some of us some time to think about how to do that and how to do that in our own lives. But see this as an exploration and an experiment. Don't think you have to get this right away. So that we're going to, eliminate those things that bring about stress and worry, and then finally to eliminate consumerism on the Sabbath. So to make your very, very best attempts not to be in any place that stirs up your consumerism. So online is always going to stir up your consumerism because you've got these push notifications coming in. Any store you're going to go into, the marketers are going to have worked very hard to make sure that you're unsatisfied with what you have and that you need what they're offering you. So if you can stay out of stores and stay offline, that will actually help the consumer part of you to settle down and to rest as well. And it'll make it even more possible for you to fully embrace and enjoy simple gifts that God has already given you and to allow God to do the work of contentment in your life on the Sabbath. That's one of the things that I've named more strongly in this book than ever, that I believe that Sabbath keeping is a spiritual formation practice, and that by definition, Sabbath does what all spiritual practices do, and that is to create space for God to come in and do what only God can do. And there are things that happen on the Sabbath that don't happen in any other way. And one of those is contentment and satisfaction and embracing the gifts of God in your life. And think about it. In the New Testament, Paul talks about the fact that godliness with contentment is a great good. So I wonder, what do you do in your life to foster contentment as a spiritual characteristic? Well, Sabbath is one thing that can really give you that. The other thing about Sabbath is that it takes us back into our humanness. We realize that we are limited, that we are tender, that we're fragile, that we're vulnerable, that we are not meant to go 24/7, day after day, week after week. And so we embrace our creatureliness. There's something very humbling about the Sabbath when you enter in and say, wow, I have to stop. I'm limited. I can't keep going. And you find yourself kind of humbled by that. But it's a good kind of humbling because you're in touch with your humanness. I encourage people to do something before you do everything. That is one of the things that's really important, I think, is that we do something before we do everything. So I even suggest that rather than thinking that you have to make your Sabbath a weekly practice right at the beginning, maybe you would identify a day out in the future, one day, and you and your family can plan together what would delight each of you and what would make it possible for you to enjoy each other's company and to be present with each other. And you all are involved and you all own it and you all look forward to it. And then on that one day, you actually do it. And then you see if you love that enough to want to go on and try to bring this into our life in a more regular way. That's one way to do something before you do everything. Something else that you could do that would be something before everything is say, well, I'm not sure we can get that 24 hours, but could we get 4? Could maybe Friday night be our Sabbath or Saturday night or Sunday afternoon after church? But could we get a few hours and just start to try? I think 4 is probably the least you could do and really get a feel for it. And the reason for that is there needs to be some time for rest if you can get that, like naps or laying on the couch or whatever, because people are tired. And sometimes you can't enjoy anything until you get some rest. So if you've got 4 hours, you might be able to get some rest and then still go do something that everybody can delight or that you would delight in. So you can't, I'm not sure you could do all that in less than 4 hours, but even that, that's doing something before you do everything. So I also encourage us to think about our communities and to try to share what we're learning and what we're doing with our families, with our church communities, with our friend communities, and even our parents. Like for myself, in my Sabbath practice, there was a season in my life where I was very encouraging parents and I was still trying to practice Sabbath. And I had to do it quite differently during that season. But God helped me to figure out how I could still get some of it, even though I couldn't get it all, when I needed to be available to them and when the weight of caring for them was very, very heavy. So those are some practical ideas. There's more in the book, and I've really intended for this book to be highly practical. And I'm really excited that we get to have a conversation tonight. That's my favorite part, is taking questions and seeing what a group like yours might bring, and how we can co-create a conversation here that might be a blessing to us all. So that is it in a nutshell. That's about the fastest that I can do talking about this book. And now I'd like to hear, what's your response? It doesn't even have to be a question. You could even just respond somehow if you'd like to. But I'm very, very open to your questions. It might take you a minute to hear what your deepest question might be. Let me give you another way of thinking about this time we have right here. One of the things I included in this book is a section at the end of every chapter entitled "What You're So Wanting to Say to God." Because I believe that this practice of Sabbath has to come from deep inside. It's so countercultural that if it doesn't come from deep inside, where you feel your desire and your need for this, it'll just feel like odds and shoulds. It'll just feel legalistic again, and I don't want that for any of us. And so maybe even in this moment, you could say, what does my soul want to say to God in response to what I'm hearing? And not just in response to what Ruth is saying, but in response to this gift of the Sabbath that comes from God, that is an expression of God's loving heart towards us. What does my soul want to say to God in response to this amazing invitation, this amazing opportunity? Don't worry about implications so quickly yet. I think sometimes people cut themselves off from their awareness of what's going on in their soul because they just right away say, well, that's impossible. I could never do that. And that's just the ego self coming in and trying to distract you from what your soul is going to say. So don't listen to that right now. Listen to the deeper thing. What does your soul want to say to God in response? Not just what I'm saying, but to God's gift of Sabbath ethics.
Yeah, sometimes it's really hard for people in ministry to find the Sabbath. Sunday is worth it, especially if there's can you speak to those two realities?
Yeah. One of the things I included in this book, which I'm really pleased about, is the fact that I included a whole chapter on seasons, the seasons of life and the challenges that go along with each season, as well as the opportunities and possibilities. So just know that there's more than what I'm going to say here, because I do know and understand that the seasons of our lives really do affect our ability to practice Sabbath. Let's go with the pastors first. And this is where this is very challenging. It can be very challenging. But my best suggestion is that churches can meet on Saturday nights, have the best shot at it, I will say, because people can go to church at 5 o'clock and that they can begin their Sabbath with worship, which is highly appropriate. Worship is a part of Sabbath, and it's also a part of the communal aspect of Sabbath. But Sunday mornings are fine too. But what I suggest is that whenever you do your church service, whether it's Saturday night or Sunday morning, that when the church services are over, it's over at church. So we don't bring people back for all sorts of other activities. And this is challenging, and I know what I'm saying. I know what I'm doing right here. I've been in the church for all my life, so I know exactly what I'm saying. It could be that there's going to have to be a couple of sacred cows that get slaughtered in order for this to work. But how wonderful would it be if the staff pulled off the church service and the high-level volunteers? By the way, I'm very concerned with high-level volunteers as a category of person. Because we as pastors have the opportunity to say, well, I'm going to take Monday or I'm going to take Friday. Well, how nice for us. You know, what are the people who are the high-level volunteers supposed to do? Where they work their 9-to-5 job Monday through Friday, then we kill them with volunteerism on the weekends. how are we helping them to learn about Sabbath? And how is our church schedule helping them to experience Sabbath? So I feel pretty strongly about this, and I don't know if it's going to go anywhere in the world or not, but I would love to see that morning worship, because that is a sacred cow, some worship. And then after that, everybody goes home, including the pastoral staff. And so they close up those doors, and by 12 or 1, they're in front of their, they're back at home in their jog pants, ready to eat some really good food or something like that. And so for the pastoral staff, I would suggest that they get to take all the way off until midday on Monday, or maybe even through the evening on Monday, depending on how much they do on the weekend. And that way, they can be with their families for part of the Sabbath, because I do really believe that families need the Sabbath together. But then they have some quiet, downtime too on Monday. And the beauty of having the whole staff take their Sabbath together is that we're not all filling up each other's inboxes while we're Sabbathing. That's a feeling of dread for me anyway. When I've taken time off and then I know that I'm going to face 200 emails when I get back, that is really discouraging. So the benefit of the whole staff taking it together is that nobody's filling up inboxes, and when we get back, we have fresh engagement with each other and with the life of the church. So that is my best suggestion, just going right to the center of your question. With young children, it may be that you need to shift your perspective just a little bit, and think a little bit more about how your family can enjoy each other's company and how you can bring a different quality of presence to each other on the Sabbath. So you might not get the 3-hour nap in the afternoon. But if the children are small and still take naps, then one of the things I want to say is make sure you nap too. During the work week when kids nap, we're washing the floor and mowing the lawn and, doing the laundry. But on the Sabbath, if they go down for a nap or they have a quiet time, then you get to have a nap or read a book on the couch or something, and do something you want to do during that time versus filling it up with work. And even that's a blessing. If the kids are older, then they can certainly handle some quiet time, but also then they can actually weigh in and help with planning. And so you may have to see Sabbath as being different than solitude and silence. And that is one of the things I try to clarify in this book, is that many people think that solitude and silence and Sabbath are the same thing, and they're not. Solitude and silence are fundamentally about being with God and God alone. Sabbath is about being with your community. It is not a time for solitude and silence necessarily. It's more about being together with your people in ways that are different than the ways that you are during the week, because you cease your work, which means that you can bring a different level of attention to your community, and particularly to your family and those that you're intimate with. And it's pretty spectacular when little kids get to experience their parents differently on the Sabbath. And they get to see that, this is who my mom or my dad really is. That whirling derby that I always see, that's not really who they are. Who they really are is this lovely person. And they can begin to practice that. Great question. All the right questions. What else? Yes. Oh, you're just. Yeah. No. Yeah. No problem. What else? Anything else in the room going on? Yes.
Not the little kids, but teenagers, late teenagers, that it's more of a hard sell to say, hey, we need to take this together, without it being the legalistic side of it. So what's your advice?
Yeah, I want to let Haley talk in a minute, so get ready. One of the sadnesses of my life is that I didn't practice. I didn't start to come into this practice until I was in my early 40s and I had teenagers at home. So that was a very big question for me. And at that time, I decided that I was not going to foist it on them because they already had their own priorities established, and I did not want them to ever experience that with anything like it. And so I communicated with them really clearly what I was going to do, that I was feeling invited by God into the Sabbath. I also communicated clearly about the things that I wasn't willing to do on the Sabbath, like I would not go shopping on the Sabbath, we wouldn't do wedding planning on the Sabbath. I had 3 weddings, planned in there. That there were certain things I would not do. And we made the hard decision also. We had our middle daughter who played club soccer, and she wanted to play on a team that played on Sundays. And so we invested a lot in her athletics, but when it came to Sundays, we said that's not a Sabbath activity for us. So if you can get a ride you're welcome to go, but that's not gonna be the day that we're packing up coolers and water bottles and wandering around trying to find soccer fields and things like that. Because that just, to me, wasn't at all restful. And, you know, that was a hard thing to do in the community, but she did fine, because we supported her athletics every other day of the week. And she did get a ride, and, you know, it became a non-issue. I was afraid that she would, you know, be disappointed with us about that for the rest of her life. But she wasn't. She was fine. And we have to trust that too, don't we? I'm going to bring some psychology into this right now, that there's a kind of differentiation that we have to practice here. And that is that when God calls us to do something, we don't say, well, God, I'm not going to do that because my kids won't want that, or they won't like it. No, they need to hear, you know, that we're feeling invited by God into this really good thing. They need to see us practicing it winsomely. They need to see us sometimes being a little separate from them, you know, if we need to be. Now, the other thing is, as a group, you could also begin to teach them about Sabbath and say, this is really the coolest thing ever. What would you guys think when we plan our Sabbath together? Or could we get a Sabbath afternoon or a Sabbath evening? And really invite your teenagers in to contribute to the thinking and the planning around Sabbath. I again mentioned Tiffany Schlein, my quote in this book, in the chapter on the power of unplugging. She has an amazing testimony of how the Sabbath day has become her kids' favorite day because of what it is and how they do it. And so I do think that it's complicated. I think you'll need discernment, but I don't think you should let it keep you from doing what you feel God might be calling you to do. Let Haley comment and then you, Scott. You want to say anything about your experience of Sabbath at that point in our home?
Yeah, I also, before I forget, want to mention that podcast, there is a podcast out there where Ruth, and my other sister Charity and her husband Kyle talk about more of how we experienced that with growing up, and then also she has been doing it with her little family. She has 10, 8, and 6-year-olds. And I do think that not all of it is applicable to teenagers, but I do think kind of the winsomeness. She talked about the only things that they have to do that day are rest, love, and be loved. Yes, those are like, and I feel like that can translate to even teenagers as well. But growing up for me, yeah, it wasn't ever anything that we had to do together, but I have lots of memories of just like, especially her being on the couch there, and so we knew that that was a day that she was very present, and then my parents were very present to us and not running around. And so I think that was a very useful way of just being invited into something, and getting to experience our house in a different way. It just felt more calm. And I think even to this day has been a reason why I have never practiced it perfectly, but when I do start to think about it, I never have like negative thoughts about it. It's always this beautiful, like joyful, whimsical thing. And so I do believe that even if you're not able to have your kids do it with you, them seeing you is probably a really great gift. And even when you're able to think about it in the delighting way, I would think there's plenty of things that our kids would be very happy to be like, oh, you want to do this with me and delight with me, rather than just being together. So that's
it's very sweet, very tender, yeah. I also tried to cook some beautiful things on that day too, so if you did think that something good would be happening around dinner time, and so oftentimes they really make sure they were around for having something special that I would cook that in a relaxed way like this. So, thank you, Haley, for sharing with us.
The word delight is a wonderful word. I'm guessing it's probably the word that's most textured and maybe misunderstood. How do you differentiate it from cultural words like entertainment? I can see my 4 grandkids. We're going to think it's to delight. Oh, I'd love to turn this Netflix on. I'm like, that delights me. How do you teach them about the sacred meaning of delight?
Well, one of the ways that I hear us all talking to little children about this is, no, we want to be with each other. We don't want to be just watching something. We want to enjoy each other's company. And the word enjoy is also a good word as well. And I think that, children have probably a limited ability to understand what things are just stimulation and what things are actually enjoying to us through gifts. And what do you think about that, Haley? I mean, because I think that's a really good question. The younger ones are a little bit, we didn't have as much of that, when we were raising our kids. There wasn't as much opportunity for that.
I think it also depends on the age. Like I have my 6-year-old and a 3-year-old, and I feel like that's still a little tricky. But when I think about my oldest sister, her kids like love to build things and love to play games. Like I even think we were just on a vacation with my little girls, and my oldest wanted to play Candyland all the time. So just to like actually be like, I'm going to sit here and play Candyland with you. So I do think that there's the want to play video games or stuff, but okay, that too.
Yeah, I was just thinking about how kids love it when they're with them. I think certainly they can learn to distinguish between kind of learners have to be spectators and kind of learn to become people who are present to each other, doing things together and giving each other our very, very best attention. But if you want a great opportunity to help them to learn, to help them learn these differences at a very young age, so they can begin to make some better decisions for themselves too. I noticed the difference between how it feels to play a game with my parents or my grandma and grandpa versus sitting and watching, a video. There's a different kind of energy that gets exchanged in that, a different kind of love, a different kind of satisfaction. And I think that they can learn how to discern that, how to feel the difference of it. But there's no question that this generation of parents, they have way more challenges than we did around this issue of technology. And it's a new battleground, it's a new battle line, and it's hard to watch sometimes. And the intentionality and also the energy that it takes to draw a line and have a line so that something better can happen is something that's really real for young parents today. And I pray for them. That God would really give them the stamina to keep showing up with the better and the best, even when they get the negative or something like. What more do you think? Anything more? I'm happy to take any other questions that you have.
Can I just make some Sabbath comments? So,
Please.
my wife's pastor, and one of the things that we've done a lot.
Can you all hear Justin?
Can you hear me? Do I need the microphone? One thing we've done a lot lately is just being outside on the Sabbath a lot. So even like we said, resting on the couch, resting in the backyard. I fell asleep in the sun a lot this summer, and it was great.
Yeah.
Reading a book or something. We also have really good friends who are always up for things, and we've gone to Morton Arboretum about 5 or 6 times, and they have kids to say they're a like-minded Sabbathy family, and we'll go on these fairly long hikes with them, and that's just wonderful because it's open conversation. Groups sort of break off and come together. So yeah, that's been really helpful. And one day my daughter was making fires in the backyard while we were out there sitting, and that worked out fine. And then nothing got burned down. But that's the sort of creative play, like spending time in unstructured enjoyment of God's creation.
That's right. And together, like you're together, like even if you're sleeping in the sun, she's over there, they're taking a soccer ball or whatever. There's still a sense of being together in it versus everybody being siloed in their rooms doing their own thing.
Exactly. We're also outside.
That's right.
Doing that. And we're also not doing yard work, which is our other thing.
That's right.
We're enjoying the fruit of our labor.
And I think what I've seen Charity Well do is also have one activity that everybody can really step up into and look forward to, like the zoo or kayaking or boating or something that the whole group says, yeah, that's what we want to do. And you wouldn't be doing it if it was another day of the week. We're doing it today because it's habit. And we get to enjoy what we want to enjoy today. Oh, what is that thing to that in our life rhythms and do it not only for ourselves but for our children, so they can have that in their lives too as things get more and more complicated. Yeah.
So, I have a chaotic. If you were with me this year, I have to, so that would get down crazy. I saw you, I don't know, it's been a few years ago. And so I started doing more Sabbath moments for hours and so defining Sabbath because my schedule is so chaotic and I never know where I'm going to be. I found that it's been really helpful to do it more momentary, and I wish it could be all day, but I'm traveling on the highway a lot, so to try to get back and stuff. So sometimes I think the best way to start, at least for me, starting after hearing you speak a few years ago, was to start with Sabbath moments or hours, versus trying to do the whole day.
Yes.
So
Yeah, I think that's excellent, and you can be more intentional about finding those, like even driving in a car, like you said, you have to be on the road some, to make a choice not to be on the phone and not to be turning on podcasts and whatever, but to actually say, this is going to be a Sabbath time when I'm actually resting my mind and resting my emotions, and resting myself and being present to God and present to myself and my body. Even those kinds of moments can become Sabbath rest moments versus what we typically do, which is fill up every single extra moment we have with stuff, even sitting in a doctor's office waiting for an appointment can be a Sabbath moment if you choose not to do all the things that you normally do. Yeah, so I really appreciate that. And I'm really glad that you have found a way, even in the midst of a life that seems to mitigate against it. You have found a way to claim Sabbath for yourself. Amen. Well, if there's nothing else, I'm going to close with a Sabbath poem. How that sounds. And I want to invite you to maybe settle into an open stance there in your chair. Go ahead and uncross legs, uncross your hands. Open your hands on your lap if that is comfortable. And the opening of the hands is really a prayer posture that says to God, I'm open. I'm not clinging and grasping like I normally do, but I'm open to what you might have to give me in this moment. The feet flat on the floor and the back straight is just a way of saying to God, I'm alert, I'm awake, I'm present. I want to hear from you. Maybe we can just hold the wonder. This poem is called On Time. There have to be times in your life when you move slow. Times when you walk rather than run, settling into each step. There have to be times when you stop and gaze admiringly at loved ones, marveling that they have been given to you for this life. Times when hugs linger and kisses are real, when food and drink are savored, gratitude and humility, rather than being gulped down on your way to something else. There have to be times when you read for the sheer pleasure of it, marveling at the beauty of words and the endless creativity putting them together. Times when you settle into the comforts of home and become human once again. There have to be times when you light a candle and you find a tender place inside you that loves or sorrows or things, and you pray from that place. Times when you let yourself feel, when you allow the tears to come rather than blinking them back because you don't have time to cry. There have to be times to sink into the soft body of yourself and love what you love, simply because love itself is a grace. Times when you sit with gratitude for the good gifts of your life that get lost and forgotten in the rush of things. Times to celebrate and play, to roll down hills, to splash in water or make leaf piles, spread paint on paper or wall for each other. There have to be times to sit and wait for the fullness of God that replenishes body, mind, and soul, if you can even stand to be so full. There has to be time for the fullness of time, where time is meaningless.